Good morning and welcome. Moss Adams is pleased to present today's webcast, Achieve Your Goals with Automated Reporting, Data-Driven Insights for Power and Utilities. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
I am pleased to introduce today's presenters from Moss Adams, Colleen Rozillis, Director, and Aaron Tyler, Senior Manager. With that, I'll turn it over to Aaron to get us started.
All right, thank you. And today, Colleen and I will be covering a few of these subjects. We're going to start off by Colleen's going to start off by talking about strategic planning, and that's going to lead into a discussion about what kind of KPIs and measurements you might want to have and how to measure for your outcomes. That will dovetail nicely into a discussion with myself around the fundamentals of data analytics. And then we'll use that as a springboard into a brief case study on a power utility client that we've been working with and how they've been using data. From there, I'll pass it back to Colleen to talk about board communications. And at the end, we'll have time for questions and answers. So as we're sitting here, please do put those questions you're having into the chat window, and we'll do our best to answer them. And now to Colleen for strategic planning.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. We really want to talk about data today, but when we think about data-driven decision-making and really making effective decisions as a leadership team, engaging your board effectively, the basis for that is a solid strategic plan. So I'm going to walk through some strategic planning best practices to really ground us in our presentation today. Many organizations, I also just want to acknowledge, tossed out their strategic plans after this last year. It might be a good time to just revisit yours, dust it off, revisit and say, do we want to update this to reflect our new reality? Is there anything that we need to change to be more flexible considering everything that's happened and reflect our new operating environment, things that have happened, especially within the realms of what's happened with our workforces and employee safety and remote work and things like that. There have been a lot of changes in the last year. And so thinking about revisiting our goals and having those conversations, it's a great time to do that. So I'll give you a little bit of a refresher here. So here's a kind of a basic strategic planning framework. A couple of things that I want to point out here. You know, at the top we have what I would call are kind of the core elements of a strategic plan. So we've got those vision, values, and mission. Those are really important parts for any organization's strategic plan. Those are things that don't often change. We might see a vision be something that sticks around in your organization for 10 years or more. We might update our values and mission every time we update our plan on kind of a 3 to 5 year basis, but we might not change the language super often. Those help us to make decisions because when we're in a resource-constrained environment, when we're trying to prioritize and make trade-offs, it helps us to understand, okay, if we are trying to decide to do something new, if we have to make trade-offs between two things, does this align with our mission? Does it align with our values? Is it going to get us closer to our vision? And if it's not, then we probably shouldn't do it and really have that conversation. We should also be establishing 3 to 5 year goals. Goals are increasingly becoming cross-functional. You know, we're seeing the challenges that we're tackling, the things that we want to achieve, really being things that we want our whole organization to achieve, not just siloed into different parts of our organization. Establishing those priorities, right? What's important to us, what's important to our ratepayers, our stakeholders, and our partners, and then identifying those key performance measures and measuring how we're going to achieve those. At the management level, then, we want to see each department, each program, establishing those objectives and performance measures as to how are we going to actually achieve these goals. So some of those might come directly from those strategic priorities. I'm thinking about, you know, your capital program, those folks who are engaged in capital project delivery, that's probably going to come straight from there. In other cases, they might have to develop some priorities and objectives to support the goals, and then coming up with their own performance measures so that they can say, okay, this is how we're going to achieve those. And in the ideal organization, what we want to see is that staff are connected too, so that at the individual level, when we're setting our goals and objectives for the year, that we're saying we understand how we're connected to the strategic plan. We know how we all contribute in some way, and that that's reflected in the individual performance review. So when I'm at a client site and I'm walking around, you know, I would say maybe 1 out of 10 organizations, they've got a strategic plan on one page and it's up in everybody's office or workspace, right? That's an organization where you really feel like, okay, people are connected to this organization and they understand what our goals are. Those are people who probably know that when they're coming around to their annual review time, okay, my goals are connected to this organization's goals. If we're keeping this fresh in our minds and we're engaging folks in the planning process, then this can be achieved. When we're developing our strategic plan, there are a lot of things that we want to include, and there is a lot of information that we already have in our organization that we often don't include when we do the plan, because we often just kind of sit down and we do a couple of whiteboarding sessions and we come up with, okay, what do we want to achieve over the next couple of years? I want to encourage you to think about all of the data that's already in your systems and all of the people that you come into contact with every day within your organization and your stakeholders who are really great resources for learning about your organization and thinking about where do we want to go. So think about what your forecast looks like. Think about scenario modeling in your forecast and whether you want to include that in your strategic planning sessions. Thinking about your risk management. So when you're doing risk planning, when you're thinking about risk mitigation, what do we learn from those scenarios and the things that we do to mitigate risk that we can include in our strategic planning as well, because that's really important, particularly for a utility where we really are dealing with some really important core infrastructure for our communities. Thinking about our programs and our operations and all of the data that comes out of there, and also the things that we want to achieve, right? What are potential growth areas? What are areas where we might be able to leverage grants and additional funding? What's happening in terms of our workforce? And we definitely want to engage our staff, right? So we want to do surveys of staff. We want to see, sometimes we do focus groups, right? See what staff are thinking about, what's important to them. They're a great resource for where do we want to go, what's important to us, where are the bottlenecks in our organization, and where are things that we can help to make things be more efficient and effective. And then really making sure that we're engaging our stakeholders and our partners, thinking about our ratepayers and our members, however we're structured, really thinking about engaging that community that is really core to who we serve. And so, in a utility environment, that can be many different entities, and thinking about how do we engage them. And even just asking, we're doing a strategic planning process, we're updating our plan, have you updated yours recently and can we take a look? Having a conversation about what's important to you as you're moving forward and what are the external factors and internal factors that you're thinking about. Those can be really rich conversations that can help you decide what do we want to include as we're shaping our goals and priorities. And then finally, really engaging your leadership team. Really getting your board and getting your leadership team together and thinking about what are our priorities and goals and how do we want to move forward together. We don't want to plan to sit on a shelf. I think that one of the biggest mistakes an organization can make is to go through a planning process and just let that plan sit on the shelf for the next 5 years. We really encourage you to build that boat and then actually get in the boat and take an annual look at what you want to achieve, what has changed, to look at your budget. Budget time is a really great time to do this, and develop that annual operating plan. And I've got an example of an operating plan. This is from the city of Suwanee, Georgia. They actually include this in their budget, which is kind of interesting, but they do it at the same time. And they put together their goals and objectives for the year. It's tied exactly to their strategic plan. They do it for all of their functions across the city, and it aligns really well to their plan, but it also very much states this is, what we're planning to do, and they try to make it measurable. And so that way when they come back and they're doing kind of budget monitoring and they're communicating to their council about how they're making progress, then they're actually able to truly monitor that with the data that they have available and say, okay, here's what we said we would do, and here's where we're actually going. Danielle, it looks like we've got a polling question.
Thank you, Colleen. Does your current ERP platform contain data analysis and visualization tools? A, yes, we use it somewhat, but it doesn't fully meet our needs. B, yes, we use it extensively and it fully meets our needs. C, we tried to use it and it doesn't meet expectations. Yes, we need to assess the functionality before using it. E, no, our ERP does not contain these tools. F, I'm not sure. I'll give you a few moments to respond. To participate, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. If you can't see the submit button, please enlarge the slide area.
That's pretty interesting results here. It looks like some people are pretty happy with their systems, and what we see is that ERPs can be really polarizing. Either people love it or they hate it, and it looks like it is meeting some people's needs, and in some cases it's not quite there yet. That's an interesting result. Thank you very much for participating, and I'll hand it back to Colleen.
Great, thank you. Okay, so performance measures have been around for a long time. We mostly see organizations kind of pick the easiest measures, which are really those workload measures, kind of data in, data out. And what we really like to see are measures tied to the outcomes that we want to achieve. So we'll go back to another kind of view of a strategic plan, which is really thinking about our objectives and our strategies from that kind of community and board and leadership level at the top, and then individual level at the bottom. So when we're establishing outcome measures and thinking about things that we're communicating to our board, that we're communicating out more broadly, those are those things that affect everyone, that are really tied directly to our broad goals. They might be condition measures that we might not completely control. They might be outcome measures tied directly to our goals. And then at that next level, we've got that program and service level measures. Those are really aligned with our programs and aligned with that level of program and service level outcomes and priorities that we establish in our annual operating plans and in our program plans to really achieve those goals in our strategic plans. And on the bottom there, we've got those individual activities and programs and services, so we can really drill down and get to individual metrics, individual outcomes, outputs, and efficiencies. We're probably not reporting those to the board and publishing them widely, although we can, and that's data that can really help on a day-to-day basis us to understand what's happening kind of going on every day. So a couple of examples of outcome-based performance measures. If you've got a specific program, you want to think about what are the results we're trying to achieve, really define what your target is, establish intermediate targets, establish those end targets, and really define against that target. In operations, we often see O&M expenditures as a very frequently used performance measure. Thinking about turnover, especially in this past year, we see that a lot as a performance measure that we're looking at. We're also seeing employee diversity and leadership diversity as some operational measures that a lot more of our clients are tracking. And then in customer service, I would say the #1 winner there is resolution rates. With respect to efficiency and effectiveness, it's really easy to put these two measures in place. So the first is your cost per your customer for your population served. Very easy to just do that calculation and see, okay, what is our functional cost for each of our direct services, and track that over time and see what's happening. We often see our internal services like IT and HR and finance. They usually don't get tracked so much in performance measures, and they'll often say, oh, you don't have to track us, or we don't need to be tracked. You actually can, and it can be pretty interesting to see what the results are in terms of just what the cost is to provide those services per FTE. You know, in a utility environment, especially when we're thinking about public utilities, it can be very hard to make the case for hiring additional internal service staff, because we always want to be looking at those folks who are delivering that public service directly. And especially since the last recession, what we have seen is that internal service staffing has really not caught up with the staffing of the direct program staff. And so when we look at that cost per FTE, we can often see workloads and capacity in a different way. And that can help us sometimes to make the case to a board more effectively or differently than we have in the past. So when we're putting a dashboard together, a couple of things to think about, especially as we're communicating out with these dashboards. So a successful dashboard is simple and understandable, and we understand what it means. That means that the definition of success is aligned. Everybody understands what we mean when we are establishing a target, that what we mean when we say we're successful. So in some organizations, that's a red, green, yellow. In some organizations, that's really clearly defining that target. A dashboard is really grounded in that concrete data. We shouldn't have to spend too much time interpreting the data. I've worked with a lot of organizations where they've got a dashboard and then they have, you know, a couple of pages explaining what that data is. That means that we're not doing as good of a job with the data as we could. I also want to talk a little bit about benchmarking here, because elected officials especially love benchmarking. They want to know, okay, what are our peers doing? From a consulting perspective, you know, we can find peers to tell kind of any story with respect to benchmarking. What's really the most valuable thing in your organization is to find what's the target, right, for us? What do we actually want to achieve? And when we start out with that identifying performance measures, we'll often collect a couple of years of prior data and say, what's the story this data is telling already? Is this actually meaningful, and is this a measure that makes sense? And then we also wanted to just note, let's use a manageable set of KPIs. So I've had clients before where we've walked in and they've had more than 1,000 KPIs. And so that's really not going to help us to make decisions if we're overwhelmed by the amount of data that's in front of us. And once we have a set of outcome-based metrics, then we can actually use that to help our budgeting as well. So we can use our budget instead of saying, okay, what are we going to keep? What are the things that we have to slash from this budget? We can talk about, okay, how can we achieve our goals? Here's how we're going to achieve our results. And it can help us to really change the conversation about how we're going to achieve our goals when we're actually using an outcome-based perspective as opposed to just a straight, okay, here's what we can accomplish with the dollars that we have. And Danielle, back to you for another poll.
Thank you, Colleen. Which types of data do you believe would provide the most value to your utility? A, benchmarking and KPIs. B, financial. C, service order and trouble tickets. D, customer and sales. E, plant. F, what if scenario analysis. G, personnel. As a reminder, if you'd like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. Okay, I'll give you a few more seconds. It looks like we're just waiting for a few more responses. Wonderful. Now I'll close the poll, and here are the results.
Interesting. So coming off of what Colleen just said, benchmarking KPIs is definitely very important. Financial is pretty big as well. There's some other things in here, but yeah, I think that's very interesting, and this really leads nicely into a discussion about data analytics. And we'll get to KPIs and fundamentals here a little bit more in a minute. But getting started, KPIs and benchmarking here in a minute. But for the fundamentals, this is kind of going into the why we want to do this. And I think pretty much everybody has an enterprise resource program or a set of programs that house their information right now. If we were kind of pulling information on that earlier. And we really want to take that information and we want to move beyond just examining it. We want to grow with that information, and we want to get to the point where we're developing either news, which is kind of the information with context, or intelligence, which is that information with context and some analysis combined. And what we're really driving towards here is we want to get to the point where we can give management at different levels of the company, hopefully, the ability to act quickly on the insights that are shown in that data. And so again, a lot of people have an ERP system, or maybe several ERP systems for different parts of the enterprise. And those are usually really good record-keeping systems, but sometimes they can be really hard to get the information out of. And so they do typically have standard reports, especially for things like finance or for, some personnel matters, but not all of them have a whole lot of ad hoc reporting. Some of them do, especially in the telco industry, do have the ability to create special ad hoc reports. And there are some like NISC that have things like Mosaic, which are kind of an ad hoc reporting system that's graphical, which is a wonderful tool if you can make it work. In a lot of those cases, what we're seeing is those tools are kind of bound to only the stuff that's in the system, and oftentimes it's only 1 or 2 dimensions that are able to be shown at a time. And we really want to kind of move beyond that, like I was saying a minute ago, to get to context. And we also want to move beyond it to get to kind of a visual representation of it. And Colleen alluded to this a moment ago, where you can see those trends and outliers. There's just a lot more information that can be communicated when you have that visual interface. And we typically think of that as that dashboard layer as being kind of a delivery layer, and it allows you to show other things. You can bring context in terms of data that's coming from other parts of the organization or maybe from outside the organization, whether that's government data or weather data or something like that. You can also bring in big budget forecasting files. You can bring in some other kind of like new tools, whether that's AI or machine learning or predictive modeling, optimization models, inventory flow models, things like that, and you can start to get to that insight. And we really want to give people those insights so they can make good and timely decisions with that information. And I skipped over one thing here. In terms of the company growth being in the middle, the reason that we put that in the middle is what we're seeing for a lot of our clients is that the companies are all growing, and in many cases they're growing in more than one dimension at a time. So you're seeing companies that are growing generally in terms of like work is just getting more technical every day, and in a lot of cases the line counts and the customer counts are going up, but the workforce is staying relatively the same size, and so people are having to become a little bit more efficient. And so there's a lot of different growth there. And one of those elements of growth is just looking at the equity of who we're serving. Are we serving the community equitably? Are we giving everybody an equal opportunity to use our services? And those are kind of things that are on the map here shortly for some regulatory action. But those really will drive that push from just information to insight. And then for some reason on my screen, I'm not seeing all of the pillars here, but I can walk through them really quick. And when we think about the fundamentals, we really want to build a solid foundation so that we can do more advanced analysis. And generally that starts with a good infrastructure. And I think in the past we tend to think of infrastructure as that large machine that's sitting in a server room, but it's really more than that now. It certainly is that machine, but it's also your regular internet connection, whether that's sufficient. It's also any other services that you're adding, whether that's a Google Sheets or a Smartsheet type system, or if you're using Salesforce or another system. And there's no wrong or right answer here. It's really about making sure that you have a system that works for you and that it's meeting all of your needs. And from there, the next thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that we have curated information that it's accessible for us that the information is accessible to all the people who need it to make a decision. And we've seen a lot of different ways of going about that, whether that's a data warehouse, but a lot of modern analytics tools like Tableau or Power BI can help curate that information. And the real goal there is to get it to those decision makers in a secure way that they can use it. And then that will enable us to go to the next step, which is the use of it to make decisions. So that kind of the habituation of using data to make decisions, data-driven decision-making, fact-based decision-making, whatever you want to call it. And that's really just, go into the brief with the data, and that's making dashboards that support your processes. And then from there, what you'll see is that, once you have those things in place, and hopefully they're at least somewhat automated, you can kind of get to this point where if you have 25 answers on a dashboard, you're going to have 25 new questions tomorrow. And that's going to allow you to really dive deeper into things. It's not going to replace your intuition or your experience. What it's going to do is augment it. So you're going to feel more comfortable about the kind of standard baseline pieces of information, and then you're going to dive deeper into the questions. And that's that intelligent insights piece. And then from there, the last piece kind of grows on its own, and that's that data culture that we want to encourage people to have. And a data culture is simply a place where people go looking for that, and they expect data to be presented, and they look for additional things that are relevant to measure. And I alluded to this a little bit a minute ago, but giving your numbers better context is really important. And this is really where a lot of the modern dashboarding and analytics systems shine. And that's because they can take all those little pieces on the screen, kind of on the left side column there, and they can combine them all together into a layer that everybody has access to, that you have that one source of truth for your employees and your managers to use. And hopefully they can display it also in an easy-to-read fashion. And giving that context is really important. And as an example, I'm going to show a little bit of information from a client of ours here in a moment. But they requested to see a variety of different things, and one of the things we ended up building for them was a weather dashboard that shows heating degree days as part of their finance dashboard set. And so what that gives you is that ability to look at what revenue is probably going to look like, based on the kind of the main driver of the revenue there being electricity for that utility. And that's just a wonderful example because we're able to take that out of their ERP system, but we're also able to go to the National Weather Service or NOAA and connect to the different zip code weather stations and use that. And typically, while we're kind of on this slide, we'll think about the dashboard as a delivery layer for other things. And we mentioned this a moment ago, but a lot of ERP systems, typically right now, what they're showing you is kind of the same thing as the dashboard on your car or the rear view mirrors on your car. They're showing you things that either are happening right now or have just happened. And what we're working at right now with a lot of our clients is getting to the looking out the front window stage where we're going to be able to add a more dynamic component using dashboards as the delivery vehicle to add that machine learning in there. Perhaps some artificial intelligence that kind of looks at the overall patterns and it says, hey, it's the 15th of the month, you issued the bills on the 5th of the month, and so we have a pretty good guess right now who's going to pay them and who's not going to pay them based on what's already happened and some other trends. We can also look at, long-term weather trends and weather cycles and kind of, other things. We've also looked at some interesting inventory problems that had really advanced components to them. It's really interesting to see that. And again, the whole point here is we want everybody to have the same source of truth. We want them to have, quick and reliable access to that information, which sometimes is really difficult to get. And with that, we're going to go to our next polling question.
Thank you, Aaron. Do you believe your utility collects sufficient amounts of data to become more data-driven? A, yes, the data is there and the tools provide near real-time insight. B, no. C, somewhat. The data exists but can't easily be accessed and leveraged for decisions. For those of you that would like a copy of today's slide deck, you can download them from the folder that says Slide Deck and Handouts to the right of the slide. We will also be sending the slides via email after the webcast. A few more moments for responses here, and I will close this poll. And here are the results.
All right, that's very interesting. So we ran a similar survey in an online environment for the telecommunications industry a few months ago, and what we saw was pretty similar, and I'll actually show that on the next slide. And what we saw in that was very similar to today is about a third of people have tools and they're satisfied with them. Essentially, they're able to get the insight they need, which is really good. But the other, two-thirds, almost three-quarters in the case of this particular survey are saying that either they don't think they're collecting enough data or that the data isn't accessible. And this is really what led us to the PUD that we did this case study with. This public utility came to the table last fall and they said, hey, we have not a terribly large staff. We have a lot of work to do on the network. We're getting started on a lot of projects right now, and we really want to get our arms around the data, and we want to have better visibility also for the other stakeholders. They wanted to make sure that the board and that the public could get the instant or near instant access to the information that they needed. And so that brought them to us, and we did a project with them, which we'll go over some of the highlights here in a moment. But now's a really good time to mention that that there are two really large groups of value with getting more getting more visibility to your information. And the first one is that there's a tendency for it to make management more comfortable with the decisions that they're making. You have data to back it up. And we have a very large retail client who kind of likes to say that they're happy to spend money on data analytics because they believe that if each manager that uses it makes one good decision a year, that it'll pay for the cost of creating the service. And I think that that's probably underselling it a little bit. I think they find that they are making several good decisions a year, probably quarterly or monthly. So there's a difficulty in creating an ROI calculation for that because it's really hard to prove what bad things didn't happen or what good things did happen that might not have. But that's one large value chain. The other value chain is understanding that this comes with a certain layer of automation. When you do a dashboard system as part of your reporting environment, there's a certain layer of automation, and that replaces a lot of kind of the Excel drill or CSV drill where you're going into the systems, different places in the enterprise oftentimes, and you're collecting the information manually and then trying to patch it together. You're replacing that with essentially an automatic flow that's going to run probably daily and really trim down some of those times. So those are the two kind of large value pieces in this. And for this client, what we did is what we like to do with every data engagement. We want to start with an assessment, and we want to do this for a number of reasons. And the first is we want to hear what specifications you would like to see built into any system that goes forward, and whether we're building it or somebody else is building it. And we want to get that all down on paper, and we create a specifications list for that and then share that back and forth to make sure we have it right. But we also use that to prioritize things. And so we'll build out these maps here, like the one on the left, which is a systems diagram of how Tableau or Power BI reporting instance might work. And then on the right side, you have the dashboards that the specifications that you said would kind of align to, we think, and what they connect to. And this can be really helpful, whether we end up doing the construction of it or not. It can be really helpful in terms of knowing where different things are in the system and knowing what systems are involved and how they connect, and that they can be connected. We really do want to get in there and test connect to things and make sure that what we're proposing is feasible moving forward. And then we want to work with you to set your priorities. And so I think Colleen kind of mentioned this in her piece, but we really want to make sure before we go into dashboards that they're going to deliver value right away. So we want to start with those things that are going to move the needle the most at the very beginning. And I'm going to show you a few slides here that kind of go over things that we found working with this public utility were really interesting or really helpful. And the first is the KPIs. And this is very similar to what Colleen was saying about identifying KPIs. And KPIs can be a number of things, and in a lot of cases they're financial measures, but they don't have to be. They can be a lot of different things. And in this case, this client, what we found was that the discussion was really helpful for them. They hadn't really thought about certain KPIs. They had kind of their standard 4 or 5 things, and we brought some of our other items in that we had experience building, and we said, how about these? And we were able to work cross-functionally with different parts of the Moss Adams team to really identify what other KPIs could be. So we were able to help them out a little bit with that. And we've seen a variety of different things with KPIs. We've seen them be goals that management sets for themselves. We have one client whose the KPI is kind of what the board or the owner, I guess, told them the management would have to do to get a bonus. We have them be assignments directly from the board or maybe from a regulatory agency. And I think one of the KPIs that's not shown maybe on the screen here is whether or not, or I guess when the bond service payments would be ready. And so that was something we were able to build out. And we were able to see some interesting things about the customer base of this particular client that were a little bit surprising, I guess. And they have a fairly constrained geography. but we saw that they're seeing good customer count growth, and I guess I didn't really expect that going in. I kind of thought it'd be maybe less large than it is. And we were able to see that the split for the different products were, maybe not what they expected. We thought that water, for example, wasn't nearly as large as it showed up in terms of the total revenue. And then the graphic on the lower right really isn't customer counts. That's revenue by rate schedule. But I think it was surprising to us to see how large the commercial rate or the commercial customers had become over time. And I took a lot of the other stuff out of there. There was another 40-something rate codes, but I took those out for this demo. And it was really neat to see how actually they kind of just went down, and you kind of really had this main focus on, single phase residential and commercial power. And the drivers of commercial power were pretty significant. And then this particular client also had mentioned that they were really interested to get a better picture of how their network was operating. And this is kind of utility centric. I know we have a lot of folks from other industries on the webinar today. Getting your arms around the geography can be really helpful, regardless of what industry group you're in. And this particular case for outage management, for physical plant, and for service orders and trouble tickets, or I guess work orders in this case, we were able to put some really interesting maps together with the table data and with some counts, and we get to some really neat insights about how the network physically functions. So you're able to see the different substations, and we're able to see on this dashboard in the live version, you can scroll laterally through the timeline, and you can see outages occur. And in some cases, you can see one substation take down another substation. And on a few of the other slides that aren't shown, we had those cause codes that were really interesting too. We could see that in certain places there was like one main constrained piece of terrain where trees were falling on the power lines and causing the bulk of the outages. And we're also able to see that when weather was noted, that wind and ice were the primary weather causes. And those are all things that I think people intuitively know, but they can't quite quantify it. And I think the neat thing is we're able to go forward from there and say, hey, if you're going to spend money on maintaining the network or improving the network, here are some places to do that. And I think one of the other things we showed with this client was the ability to bring in some new measures or to think of things maybe a little bit different. And so here we have average revenue per user, and that's something that you see maybe more commonly in the telecommunications industry. I think it has a different name in the utility industry. But when we built this out, I think we were really surprised to see how large the first very large industrial client was. And then I think it goes way down the page, but if you look through the dashboard, you can turn on different service lines, you can turn on and off different rate schedules, and you can kind of see what the average electrical customer at the residential level is doing and what the average industrial customer is doing, versus like retail and mom and pop shops. And it's really neat to be able to look at that and explore through that. And I think that really helps them get their arms around who their customer base was. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Colleen for communicating with the board.
All right, so the most fun part of data is then having to talk about it with your board. And I think we have kind of a constant, it's both a challenge, I would say, and an opportunity to educate and engage our board in this kind of stuff, because we live in the day-to-day of this data. This is all information that we understand, and boards by nature turn over. We've got folks who have different levels of sophistication with data, financial and operational information, and really being able to engage them at the appropriate level. Dashboards can be a really great way to communicate, what's important, right? And if we've gone through a strategic planning process, if we have a good plan in place and we've oriented them to the plan, if they haven't gone through the process with us so they understand here are our goals and here's how we communicate really around our goals and priorities, then we can really help our boards use this data in an appropriate way. So at a basic level, our boards have a fiduciary responsibility for our utility operations. They have this duty of care, right? So they should be looking at our audit results and our budget, at our financials, looking at our policies, things like that. What's also important is that the board is engaged at the right level. And I think we've probably all experienced this, right? That we have certain board members that are way too high up. They're really only interested in super high level policy, maybe not even really interested in policy and just kind of, they're there to check the box, right? And then we have other board members that are very much in the weeds, operationally focused. An example that I give all the time is that I actually served on a board once, and I had another board member who at every single board meeting asked for the accounts receivable aging report. That's what he was interested in. That is way too in the weeds for a board member and not the right place, right? But we can use the dashboards, the information of establishing the targets, talking about our priorities, figuring out exactly where we want you to be and how we want to communicate, really in order to target our board decision-making where we want it to be. So if we want to guide toward making operational decisions in a certain way, we go back to some of those dashboards that Erin showed, right? So here are the metrics that we're really looking at. Here's the target we're hoping to achieve, and here's how we need to get there. Here are some of the financial decisions that we have to make in terms of, potentially bonding and lending, the scenario analysis that we potentially need to do, and walking them through that and being able to visualize is a really great way, even for someone who might not be, super financially savvy or engaged in utility operations on a day-to-day basis. Presenting information visually can be a great way to do that. I would also really recommend, as you're onboarding new board members, to giving them a good introduction and maybe an annual refresher to all of this foundational stuff. So if these are things that you're going to be bringing forward to them on a regular basis, this client that Erin was talking about, I work with them as well. One of the things that we're working on with them is a financial forecast. And so we've been talking about giving them a presentation and then coming back kind of on a semi-annual basis to provide a refresher on, remember we did a financial forecast, here are the things we put into it, and then when they've got new members, making sure that they understand that. So that really where they're focused on are the appropriate outcomes and priorities. I really like to remind boards when I work with them that their focus is very much on the what, and that when we talk about the how and we ask them for their advice on the how, it's really up to staff to implement and then talk about, the data that we have and showing our outcomes as really a demonstration of how effective we were. So what we really like is for a board to be in the place of, here's a plan that we have, we're going to approve it, we're going to, provide our advice, and then we're going to let you go off and implement it, kind of the same with a budget. And Danielle, I think with that, we've got our very last polling question.
Thank you, Colleen. Does your board leverage data to make decisions and affect strategic change? A, yes, B, no, C, somewhat. Once you've completed all CPE requirements, you will be able to download a PDF of your CPE certificate from the CPE progress window to the right of the slide view. Looks like we're just waiting for a few more responses, so I'll give you a few more seconds. Wonderful, and here are the results.
Oh, thank you. All right.
So it looks like, okay, go ahead.
Sorry. We both were excited to answer this question. So we're at about half, actually, data making decisions, which is good, actually. This is a good response. Erin, what would you like to add?
No, I think that you're right. That's a really good response. And I think for the 47%-ish that are either no or somewhat, that's a growth area, and we see this a lot, and it's it's kind of a natural progression, and it's really timely right now to kind of move in that direction, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, I suppose, in some other formats. But it's a good time to set that 2-year plan to look at data.
Yeah, definitely. So this is our last slide, and I think this is a great way for those of you who answered no or somewhat, providing your board with some examples of some of these questions that you can ask, right? Giving them, when you're talking about orienting them to your budget and what's happening in your financial and operating environment, these are really good questions for them to just start thinking about. I particularly like questions about what should we be thinking about long term? So longer term expanding, really longer term capital investments. I think especially with kind of the federal infrastructure planning that's coming down, that absolutely should be something that we're thinking about and getting ready to jump on as needed. Thinking about what we're doing in terms of reserves, what we're doing with our unrestricted funds. Are we planning for another rainy day, right? We just had the biggest rainy day. We just had a rainy day that lasted, more than a year that we're just kind of coming out of, right? Thinking about what our dollar allocation is, and is it in line with our priorities? So going back to how I started this presentation and thinking about what is our vision and what are our values, is that actually in line with how we're spending our money? That can be a really valuable question to engage your board in and truly having that conversation. Danielle, I think we are ready for Q&A. Do we have anything from the audience?
We do, and our first question is, how would you recommend a company get started working more with data? Aaron, would you like to answer this one?
Sure. So I saw this come up, and I alluded to this a moment ago, but I think the first step is really to decide that you're going to do it. And I think that sounds really simple, but sometimes, it's an organizational change, and it needs to have a lot of energy around it. And so having especially a member of the leadership team, whether that's the CEO, CFO, COO, or just a really dynamic manager, decide that you're going to do it is really important. And then from there, setting some goals. It doesn't have to be, I guess there's no hard, fast rule, right? But probably setting a goal for what you're going to do this year or this half of this year, and then setting a 2 and maybe a 5-year goal for kind of moving into certain types of data or using certain types of more advanced reporting is really important. I think that's a good place to start. And do we have an additional question, or Colleen, do you want to?
It looks like we do have time for one more question.
I think I could just add on to that, and something you said, Aaron, about where it comes from. I was thinking about a question that we often get about this is where should performance measures come from, right? Who should own them? And often the natural thought is that they come from IT, and we see them come from all over the place. So it can come from finance, because often finance has access to all of the different systems, and if that's where your forecast is coming from or where your reporting is coming out of, that can be a natural place. We also sometimes see in the public sector performance measures initially start in actually internal audit, because again, we have access to a lot of data and the ability to do analysis kind of cross-functionally. What's important is that whoever is the owner is someone who is able to work cross-functionally and work with the leadership team to really focus on that. What's important? What are the outcomes that we want to achieve?
Yeah, and I think that when you mention IT, I think it's really important to say that in my experience at least, IT is usually really, I think, they have a lot going on. And they're always an important part of the data process, but if you just task it to them, usually that's very difficult, because you're going to get what people say, you get what you measure, but you also get what you resource. So if IT doesn't have the resources to do that, that can be very difficult. And I think in our really successful major dashboard projects, a lot of times IT was an important partner from the beginning. and we've certainly helped teach them how to maintain the system, but what they really needed was a contact team to come in and kind of help kickstart it and get them over that initial hump, and then they'll be off to the races. And there's a lot of other folks that are just regular business users that can jump in there and build additional stuff once that's initially connected and stuff. And I think we have time for one more question.
Absolutely. Our next question is, what do you do to ensure the security of the systems and data involved in doing analytics?
I can start with that as well, and I think this is something that's probably at the forefront of everybody's mind after the last couple of weeks of random data hijackings. But when we come in to do a data project, what we want to do is we want to make sure we set it up from the beginning to be secure. And so we're talking about the architecture of it. We want to have typically a virtual machine that lives inside of our client's network, and we can remotely connect to that to do a lot of the work, but it keeps the computing power, it keeps most of the data inside that network. And then, that system itself should only be allowed to have read-only access to the data. So, it can't write to the enterprise databases. And for systems like SCADA data, or maybe if you're in the medical industry, if you have those essential monitoring systems, it may not want to connect to that directly. And the way that you solve this problem for data is you have those systems drop file to some, like create a CSV, for lack of a better way to think of it, and put it in a folder in the network, and then Power BI or Tableau can pick that up and ingest that as it happens. And so there's not a direct connection between the systems, and that way, somebody, actually got into that remote machine, they couldn't really do anything except for maybe turn it off. And I think that's kind of something we do. We also do have IT security folks, and so if we see something that looks like it might need attention, we can always refer it to them as well for input. And Danielle, I don't know, do we have another?
It looks like we may have time for one more question. You mentioned an assessment phase. How does that work?
Okay, the assessment phase is essentially for us, it's an opportunity to get in and test the connections to the system. And the real goal here is to get that look at, what is theoretically possible and what's practical, and then, what's the level of effort involved in doing certain things. And so I think when we bid assessment projects, they're usually low cost fixed bid, and we're really just looking to get in there and have everybody that's a stakeholder get some skin in the game. So we want to hear from the different managers and different users around the enterprise, what are your needs? What do you really like about this? What do you not like about it? What's your wish list look like? And then we kind of compile that and we go back and forth. And a lot of times there's duplicates, and that's normal. And we kind of trim it down to the unique entries, and we try to put together a written document so that everybody can see it. And a lot of times just writing the document's a really good exercise for folks. Sometimes people in finance, who a lot of times sponsor these projects, may not necessarily know what people are doing in other certain parts of the enterprise. And we've also seen customers that have bought adjacent companies, or they've bought managed service companies, or something that's kind of a similar field for them. They don't necessarily know exactly what's going on there. So a lot of times it can really increase the visibility of what the needs are. And then that gives us a good frame of reference to go forward and make recommendations and set priorities for what could be built and who should build it, and about what is it going to cost.
Great.
Danielle, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Colleen and Aaron, for a great presentation today. Unfortunately, we are out of time. If you submitted a question that we did not get to, We will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast, or you may reach out to the presenters directly. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts window to the right of the slide view. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window to the right of the slide view. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy of your CPE certificate will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. Finally, here's a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us. We hope you'll join us again next time.